At the end of the last video, we talked about how sometimes you want to repeat Python code a certain number of times or until a condition is met. That concept is called looping, and so our next couple of videos are going to be about looping in Python. And we'll begin with the simplest kind of Python loop, which is called a for loop. So the simplest for loop has a structure like this. You type for I in range 10, and what that does is it executes the indented code following that line for each value of I between 0 and 9 inclusive. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The terminology here is that the indented code following the line beginning with the word for is called the body or the suite of the loop, and the variable I is called the loop variable or the index variable. So let's see a super simple example of this in action. Here it is. We have on our first line, line 1 for I in range 5, and then a colon. And what that's going to do is it's going to execute the indented code following that, first with I equals 0, then with I equals 1, I equals 2, 3, and 4, and then it will stop. So for us, we only have indented code on line 2, and it just prints out the value of I. So what this will do is just print out I equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. As you can see, when I execute it, that really is what happens. Now actually, the range command is quite a bit more versatile than just producing numbers 0, 1, 2, 3 up to something else. It can also have a 2-argument form. So if you do range 1, 6, for example, then what that will do is produce the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in general, range AB will produce the numbers A plus 1, up to B minus 1. Let's just check this. So as you can see, we get the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's the key thing to remember here. If you use a 2-variable version of range AB, then it will produce the numbers starting with A and finishing with B minus 1. You've seen this concept before when we talked about slices of strings. So this slice of a string between X and Y produced the characters from X up to Y minus 1. The similar thing is happening here. So one reason that we might want to use for loops as mathematicians is because a for loop is perfect for doing things like evaluating summations. Let's look at an example of how we can do this. So we're going to consider this sum right here, which is the sum from I equals 0 up to 10 of I squared. We're going to figure out the value of that sum using a Python for loop. So to think about how to do this, let's consider how we would actually work it out if we were doing it by hand. We'd keep a running total, which was initially 0, so let's call that total S for sum. And then we'd add on 0 squared and 1 squared and 2 squared and so on up to 10 squared. So in other words, what we want to do is run the same add I squared to S code for each value of I between 0 and 10. And that's exactly the kind of thing we can do with a for loop and a range. So we'll do this in the next code cell right here. So we begin our code cell on line 1, defining our sum variable to be 0. And then we're going to enter a for loop. And we want for I in range 11 because that will execute the subsequent indented code for I equals 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 10, which is exactly what we want to do. And inside the body of the for loop, inside the suite, what we're going to do is increase S by I squared. So what will happen when we run this is S is initially 0, it'll get increased by 0 squared, and then 1 squared, and then 2 squared up to 10 squared. So at the end of this, the value of S will be the sum from I equals 0 to 10 of I squared. Let's run this. As you can see, there's no output here, but the value of S will now be that sum from I equals 0 up to 10 of I squared. So when I run this next code cell to print out that value, we'll get 385. That's the correct sum. All right, so this is how we can use for loops. Let's just look at some more general examples, because for loops are not just restricted to doing for something in range something else. You can do many different kinds of for loops in Python, and we'll look at a couple of examples. So beginning with lists. So you can use a for loop to do something for each element of a list. So here we've got what's called a list, which is created in Python using square brackets, and this is just the list containing the numbers 2, 4, and 6. So if you want to do something for each element of that list, then you can just type for x in range and then the list. And that will do something for x equals 2, and then for x equals 4, and then for x equals 6. So just to show you how this works, I'm going to have this for loop, and all it's going to do is print out the value of x. So this will print out x equals 2, then x equals 4, then x equals 6, as you can see. We're going to learn a lot more about Python lists later, and when you do that, you'll be able to use for loops over lists to do all kinds of useful things. So finally, I want to talk about the range command again, and just to explain that the range command is actually even more versatile than we've seen so far. We saw a 1-argument version of range, which produced the numbers 0, 1, 2 up to n-1 if you did range n. We saw a 2-argument version of range, so range AB produced the numbers a plus 1 up to b-1. And finally, the most general range is range with 3 arguments, which produces an arbitrary arithmetic progression. So if you do range start, stop, step, 3 arguments, then it produces the numbers start, and then start plus step, and then start plus 2 times step, and then start plus 3 times step, and so on. And it finishes with, if step is positive, the last number in the sequence which is less than stop, and if step is negative, the last number in the sequence which is greater than stop. So let's see an example of this just here. We're going to do for j in range 1, 12, 2. So it starts at 1. The step is 2, so it increases by 2 each time. And because the step is positive, it's going to finish with the last number in this arithmetic progression, which is less than 12. So here, that last number will be 11. And we'll get 1, then 1 plus 2, then 1 plus 2 times 2, then 1 plus 3 times 2, and so on, until we get the last number, which is less than 12. Okay, let's look at an example with a negative step. So here we go for k in range 10, 0, minus 1. So what this will do is start with 10, and then it will add on minus 1, then it will add minus 1 again. So we'll keep going, and we'll stop with the first value, which is bigger than 0. So the final value, which is bigger than 0. So that will be 1 in this case. If I just scroll down a bit, you can see that that really is where we stopped. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to say in this video is to give you a link to the Python documentation. So I'll post this notebook on Moodle and a PDF version as well, so you'll be able to click on this link yourself. But if you click on the link for the documentation at the bottom here, it'll take you to the official Python documentation. Now, often this can be a bit difficult to follow. It's written for people who are quite experienced in Python programming, so don't worry if you're not, if you don't understand everything that appears there. But the Python documentation is very useful if you need to know exactly what a particular command does. And here I've linked to the part which explains all of the features of the range command in complete detail.